The ring light on my porch felt like an interrogation lamp. My daughter-in-law, Megan, was live streaming her legacy detox, which really meant throwing my late husband's memories into black plastic bags. I knelt in the grass, clutching his old uniform, while she smiled for the camera and called me a hoarder. When I stood my ground, she didn't flinch. She whispered that if I said another word, she'd release proof that my son is a felon. She's turned my own child into a weapon against me, and I'm paralyzed in my own yard. Listen to the end to hear how I handled it, and subscribe to hear more of my journey. The plastic tore under my nails with the sound of something dying. I didn't mean to kneel. One moment I was standing on my own driveway, the gravelite had resurfaced in 2018, the bluegrass I'd paid to keep emerald and perfect for 20 years, and the next, my knees were pressed into the soil, my pleated skirt gathering dust I would never have tolerated in my office. The sun was vicious that afternoon, the kind of harsh Kentucky heat that turns everything into a glare, and inside the ripped black trash bag, I saw gold. Gold braid. Brass buttons. The deep navy wool of Jim's dress uniform. The fabric smelled of cedar and mothballs, the particular scent of the basement storage closet where I had folded it with my own hands after the funeral. I had wrapped it in acid-free tissue paper. I had placed it in the archival box with the label written in my own sharp cursive, James Sterling, Fire Chief, 1985 to 2015. Handle with care. Now it was crumpled against McDonald's wrappers and coffee grounds, the brass buttons scuffed against the gravel, one of the shoulder patches half detached and flapping in the breeze like a white flag of surrender. I didn't cry. I stopped crying in 1992 when a student accused me of bias during a disciplinary hearing and I realized that tears were a liability in a room full of lawyers. But my hands, which had signed expulsion letters and negotiated union contracts and held Jim's hand as he died, those hands were shaking. This wasn't housekeeping. This wasn't decluttering. This was desecration. A cold, liquid fury settled at the base of my spine, the same sensation I used to feel when a sophomore would try to lie to me about plagiarism, thinking I wouldn't check the sources. It was the feeling of being underestimated. It was the feeling of being tested. I looked up. It's called curating, Sarah. You should try it. Megan's voice drifted from the veranda, light and airy as a soap bubble, as if she were discussing the weather or a new recipe for avocado toast. She was framed by the white colonial pillars of the porch, my porch, the one Jim and I had repainted every 5 years, and she wasn't looking at me. She was looking at her phone. No. Not at it. Into it. The circular LED ring light was mounted on a tripod beside her, its artificial glow making her skin look poreless and angelic even in the middle of the afternoon. Her smartphone was angled just so, capturing her profile against the backdrop of the estate. She was wearing ivory linen, the kind of intentionally rumpled expensive fabric that screamed effortless elegance to people who didn't know that linen wrinkles if you breathe on it wrong. The clean girl aesthetic. I'd read about it in a New York Times trend piece while waiting for a dentist appointment. Neutral tones. Minimal makeup. The appearance of virtue. I knew what virtue looked like. This wasn't it. We're live, guys. Megan's voice pitched up, that performative chirp she used when she was talking to her community. She tilted the phone, panning the camera toward me. I saw the red dot of the recording light. I saw my own image reflected in the black mirror of her screen, a 60-year-old woman on her knees in the dirt, surrounded by trash bags, her silver blonde bob slightly disheveled. Witnessing the first step of the legacy detox, she continued, her smile widening. My mother-in-law is finally letting go of the clutter that's been weighing her down. This is what healing looks like, friends. This is what freedom looks like. She panned back to her own face, her expression radiant with false compassion. I was a prop. A before and after photo. A cautionary tale for her followers about the dangers of attachment and living in the past. I stood up. I didn't brush the dirt off my knees. I didn't smooth my skirt, though every instinct I'd honed over 30 years of faculty meetings screamed at me to restore order to my appearance. Instead, I looked directly into the glass eye of her lens. Not at Megan. At the camera. I had given keynote addresses to auditoriums of 500 people. I had stared down the president of the university during a budget crisis and made him blink first. I knew how to command a room, even a digital one. "Megan," I said, my voice a level, academic monotone, the kind I used when I was about to expel someone and wanted them to understand that the decision was final. "You have exactly 10 seconds to stop recording before I discuss your outstanding credit card debt with your loyal followers." I let the pause stretch. I counted silently, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. Specifically, I continued, the $14,000 balance at Neiman Marcus. The one you've been avoiding by rotating minimum payments across 4 other cards. I'm sure your audience would love to hear about the sustainable capsule wardrobe you purchased with money you don't have. I kept my face neutral. The social dean smile, polite, professional, utterly devoid of warmth, didn't reach my eyes. I saw her finger twitch near the screen. The red light stayed on. The ring light flickered. Megan stepped closer, lowering the phone but keeping the stream active. I could see the shift in her posture, the way her shoulders rolled back and her chin lifted. The influencer mask slipped, just for a moment, and I saw what was underneath, something feral and hungry, something that had learned to survive by smiling. Her perfume hit me before she did, cloying, expensive, a designer scent that probably cost more per ounce than my monthly water bill. Citrus and white flowers and something chemical that made my sinuses ache. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper that her phone's microphone wouldn't catch but I would never forget. "One more word about my finances, Sarah, and David loses his seat on the city council." The world narrowed to the space between us. The hum of the distant lawnmower, the rustle of the wind in the magnolia tree, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog, all of it faded into static. "I have the receipts," she continued, her eyes locked on mine. "I have the logs of the consulting fees he signed for. Every wire transfer. Every shell company. Either you're a confused senior who needs my help, or your son is a felon. Choose." Her smile widened, but her hand, the one not holding the phone, was trembling slightly. She was nervous. Good. She should be. But she wasn't bluffing. The world went silent. Not literally. The lawnmower was still humming 2 houses down. A cardinal was calling from the oak tree near the property line. But inside my head, there was nothing but a high, thin ringing, the sound of a crisis reaching critical mass. She had mapped the terrain better than I'd realized. David. My son. The boy I'd raised to believe in accountability and civic duty, the man who'd followed his father into public service because he wanted to help people. She'd turned him into a liability, a human shield, betting that my maternal instinct would override my administrative discipline. And she was right. "He's a good man," I said. My jaw tightened. I felt the muscle twitch, the small tell I'd spent years trying to eliminate during union negotiations. Jim used to tease me about it, said I looked like I was chewing glass when I was trying not to lose my temper. Megan's smirk widened. "Good men do desperate things for expensive wives, Sarah." She tapped the side of her phone with one manicured nail, a casual, dismissive gesture. "Now, pick up the trash. The audience is waiting for a breakthrough." She stepped back, angling the camera toward me again. I looked at the bags. At Jim's uniform, half visible through the torn plastic. At the 30-year career reduced to garbage. I was 60 years old. I had a PhD. I had managed crises that would have broken lesser administrators. And I was being defeated by a 28-year-old with a ring light and a mountain of debt. I reached down and gripped the cold plastic of the bags. My hands didn't shake. I wouldn't give her the satisfaction. But the weight, God, the weight, felt like lead, like I was dragging Jim's body all over again, like I was pulling him out of the hospital bed and into the ground. I began to walk toward the garage, the sound of the plastic scraping against the gravel echoing in the humid afternoon air. Each step felt like a retreat, a tactical withdrawal I hadn't authorized. I was losing. No. I was repositioning. As I passed her, I didn't look away. I kept my eyes level, my gaze steady, recording every detail the way I used to when a student came into my office to appeal a suspension. The slight tremor in her hand. The way her breath hitched when she thought I might lunge at her. The micro-expression of relief when I kept walking. A dean doesn't lose. A dean reevaluates the syllabus. By sunset, the security team had arrived. I was in the kitchen, running cold water over my hands, not because they were dirty, but because I needed the shock of it, the clarity, when I heard the drill. Two men in tactical polos, the kind of cheap rent-a-cop uniforms you see at mall parking lots, were on the porch. One of them was on a ladder, drilling into the colonial white pillar I'd had restored in 2010. The other was feeding a cable through the hole. Small black domes. Cameras. For your safety, Sarah. Megan called from the parlor, her voice bright and cheerful. The ring light was back on, illuminating the vintage wallpaper of the dining room, casting sharp shadows on the antique sideboard. I walked to the hallway and looked up. A red LED blinked to life in the corner of the ceiling, just above the threshold to my bedroom. I counted them silently as I moved through the house. Front door. Kitchen. Hallway. The study. 5 cameras. 5 unblinking eyes. I was a prisoner in a house I had paid off in 2012. The woman appeared in my kitchen the next morning without knocking. I was standing at the counter, waiting for the kettle to boil, when I heard the back door open. I turned, expecting David, and instead found a stranger pulling out a chair at my breakfast table as if she'd been invited. She was maybe 45, with dull brown hair pulled into a severe bun and a face that suggested she'd spent her life perfecting the art of disapproval. She wore a sterile gray tunic, the kind nurses wear in low-budget care facilities, and her shoes were the orthopedic clogs I associated with people who spent all day on their feet. "You must be Elena," I said. She didn't answer. She simply began opening my cabinets, moving my canisters of tea, inspecting the labels with the slow deliberation of someone conducting an inventory. "The doctor says you shouldn't have so much caffeine, Sarah." Her voice was low, a sandpaper rasp that set my teeth on edge. She found my tin of Earl Grey, the good stuff, loose leaf, imported from a shop in London I'd been patronizing for 15 years, and held it up like evidence. I reached for it. Her hand clamped over mine. Her grip was surprisingly strong. Not painful, but firm, immovable. The kind of grip that said, "I've restrained people before, and I'll do it again if necessary." "Let's stick to herbal," she said, her smile tight and professional. "We wouldn't want you getting agitated." She moved the Earl Grey to the top shelf, out of my reach, and replaced it with a box of chamomile I didn't remember buying. I stood there, my hands still extended, feeling the phantom pressure of her fingers on my wrist. David came home at 6. I heard his car in the driveway, the sensible sedan he'd bought after his father died, the kind of car a city councilman should drive, and I was in the mudroom before he'd even closed the front door. "David." I caught his arm as he tried to slip past me toward the stairs. "Look at me." He flinched. My son, my boy, 6'2" and broad-shouldered like his father, flinched when I touched him. His tie was loosened, the knot pulled low and crooked. His eyes were rimmed with red, the kind of exhaustion that comes from weeks of not sleeping, of lying awake at 3 in the morning wondering when the other shoe will drop. "What has she made you sign?" I kept my voice low, controlled, even though I wanted to shake him. His eyes darted toward the corner of the ceiling. Toward the camera. Not now, Mom. Please. His voice cracked on the last word. She's just trying to help us manage the estate. You know you've been forgetting things. I haven't forgotten a damn thing. Mom. Look at me, David. He wouldn't. He pulled his arm free, gently, the way you'd extract yourself from an elderly relative who didn't know their own strength anymore. I have a meeting, he muttered, and fled up the stairs. I stood in the mudroom, listening to his footsteps retreat, and I understood. He was compromised. A hostage in a suit. I retreated to my study and locked the door. The mahogany desk felt like an anchor in a storm, solid and real in a house that was rapidly becoming foreign territory. I pulled out my leather-bound planner, the one I'd used to track faculty meetings and disciplinary hearings for 30 years, and a fresh fountain pen. I didn't cry. I began to list. Personnel. Enemy, Megan Sterling, née, unknown. Age 28. Profession, lifestyle influencer/fraudulent nonprofit operator. Subcontractor, Elena, surname unknown. Role, enforcer. Skill set, intimidation, isolation. Compromised asset, David Sterling. Status, hostage. Assets. Estate, paid in full, 2012. Pension. Life insurance payout, Jim. Intellectual capital, 30 years institutional knowledge. Liabilities. Surveillance, 5 cameras, live feed unknown destination. Isolation, phone access restricted, son compromised. Legal threat, guardianship filing imminent. I looked up at the HVAC vent near the ceiling. The house was built in the 1940s. The ductwork was original, a labyrinth of metal that carried sound from room to room. Jim used to joke that he could hear me talking on the phone in the study from the bedroom 2 floors up. I had managed campus scandals larger than this. I had negotiated with the Department of Education during a Title IX investigation and walked away with the university's accreditation intact. This was simply an unauthorized protest. And I knew how to handle those. I sat in the dark, listening to the house settle around me. Megan's weakness was her speed. She was moving too fast, fueled by the frantic need to monetize her life before the debt collectors arrived. She needed me to be the crazy hoarder, the confused senior, to justify the guardianship. She needed a narrative that made her the hero. If I played the role, I could draw her in. I needed to isolate her financial fraud from David's signatures. I needed a trail that led only to her, that proved coercion, that gave my son legal cover when this inevitably ended in court. I needed her to confess. The scent of cedarwood drifted up from the heating vent. Somewhere in the house, Megan was probably filming another update for her followers, painting herself as the dutiful daughter-in-law managing a difficult situation. Good. Let her perform. I would give her exactly what she wanted, a target. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a stack of blank ledger sheets from a defunct university account. They were left over from 2003, back when we still did some financial tracking by hand before everything went digital. The paper was slightly yellowed, the university seal embossed at the top, official looking enough to pass a casual inspection. I uncapped my fountain pen and began to write. My handwriting is distinctive, sharp, slanted cursive, the kind they don't teach anymore. I made sure every entry was perfectly legible, the numbers large enough to catch the eye. Offshore transfer, Cayman Trust, $2.4 million legacy disbursement, Royal Bank of Scotland, $1.8 million estate liquidation fund, Geneva account, $3.1 million. Fictional. All of it. Numbers pulled from thin air, designed to trigger a predator's hunger. I left the ledger slightly protruding from a folder on the edge of the desk, visible but not obvious. Tomorrow, I would forget to lock the study door. I would go for a walk, maybe to the pharmacy, giving Elena and Megan time to search. The bait was set. I sat back in my chair, the fountain pen still warm in my hand, and allowed myself a small, cold smile. The audit had officially begun. The smell hit me first. I was upstairs, folding a cashmere sweater I'd pulled from the dryer before Elena could misplace it, when the scent crept through the bedroom window. Acrid. Heavy. The particular stench of burning leather and old paper, the kind of smell that coats the back of your throat and makes you gag. I set down the sweater and walked to the window, my fingers already curling into fists before I'd consciously registered what I was seeing. Below, in the backyard fire pit, the one Jim and I used to use for s'mores when David was little, the one we'd light on autumn evenings when the air turned crisp, Megan was tossing books into the flames. Not books. Journals. Jim's journals. I watched a leather-bound volume arc through the air, its spine cracking as it hit the metal grate. The pages caught immediately, the edges browning and curling inward like dying leaves. 40 years of his thoughts. His service logs. The careful, meticulous handwriting of a man who believed that documentation was a form of honor. The very marrow of his life, turning to black ash. Megan was smiling. The orange glow of the fire illuminated her face from below, giving her the appearance of something demonic, something that fed on destruction. Her phone was raised high, angled to capture the flames, the cleansing, the performative ritual of letting go. This is what release looks like, friends, her voice drifted up through the open window, bright and earnest. We're making space for new memories, for growth. Sometimes you have to burn the past to step into your future. Another journal hit the fire. I recognized the cover, burgundy leather, a gift I'd given Jim for his 50th birthday. Inside were his notes from the year David was born, his reflections on fatherhood, his fears about balancing the demands of the department with the needs of a newborn. Gone. I didn't scream. I didn't rush down the stairs and throw myself at her. I didn't knock the phone from her hands and shove her face first into the flames she was feeding. I simply stood at the window, my breath fogging the glass, and memorized the exact tilt of her head. The angle of her smile. The casual, careless way she flipped through the pages before consigning them to the fire, as if she were sorting junk mail. Every page she burned was another zero added to the price she would eventually pay. Elena moved through the house like a slow-acting poison. It was subtle at first. The kind of thing you'd dismiss as coincidence if you weren't paying attention. A moved chair. A misplaced pair of scissors. The thermostat adjusted to a temperature that made the house feel like a walk-in freezer. But I was paying attention. I opened the medicine cabinet in my bathroom, the one I'd organized with the precision of a hospital pharmacy, every bottle labeled and arranged alphabetically, and found my blood pressure medication missing. In its place sat a generic bottle of supplements, the label peeled off, the pills inside an unfamiliar shade of off-white. "You must have moved it, Sarah," Elena said from the doorway. I hadn't heard her approach. She had a gift for that, for appearing soundlessly in doorways and hallways like a ghost. "Your memory, you know. It's getting worse." I turned to face her, the bottle still in my hand. I didn't move it. Her smile was thin, professional, utterly devoid of warmth. "Of course you did. You've been so forgetful lately." In the parlor, I found my wingback chair, the one positioned precisely 18 inches from the fireplace, the optimal distance for reading without straining my eyes, moved 3 feet to the left. My reading glasses, the ones I kept on the side table, were gone. "Looking for these?" Elena held them up, dangling them from her fingers like a prize. She'd found them in the kitchen, she said, next to the coffee maker. I never drank coffee in the kitchen. I took my tea in the parlor. "You're getting so forgetful, Sarah," she whispered as she leaned over me to help me sit. Her breath smelled of menthol and malice, the sickly sweet scent of cough drops and something darker underneath. Her hand on my shoulder was firm, pressing down, forcing me into the chair. She wanted me to stumble. To trip over the relocated furniture. To bruise. To fall. To provide the visual evidence of frailty, of a woman who couldn't navigate her own home without assistance. I sat perfectly still, my back a rigid line of defiance, my spine not touching the cushion. I wasn't falling. I was observing her range of motion. The exact pressure she applied. The way she favored her right hand over her left, suggesting an old injury. The slight limp in her gait when she thought I wasn't looking. Everyone has a weakness. I just had to find hers. I stood in the shadows of the hallway, watching through the half-inch gap I'd left in the study door. Megan was inside. The clean girl facade was gone, replaced by the frantic, jerky movements of a common thief. Her linen outfit was rumpled, her hair escaping its carefully styled bun. She'd pushed aside the stack of books on my mahogany desk, first editions, some of them, volumes on institutional leadership and crisis management, and spread out the fake ledger I'd left as bait. Her eyes darted over my forged entries, her lips moving silently as she read. Offshore transfer, Cayman Trust, $2.4 million. I saw her pause. Saw her finger trace the line of my handwriting, as if she could absorb the money through the ink. Legacy disbursement, Royal Bank of Scotland, $1.8 million. Her breathing quickened. I could see her chest rising and falling beneath the ivory linen. Estate Liquidation Fund, Geneva account, $3.1 million. The tip of her tongue poked out, a small, unconscious gesture. She was calculating. Adding. Multiplying. Imagining what $7.3 million could do for her brand, her debt, her desperate scramble to maintain the illusion of wealth. She believed she had found the hidden hoard of a paranoid old woman. She pulled out her phone and began photographing the pages, her hands trembling slightly with excitement or adrenaline or greed. It was hard to tell which. Greed is a predictable motivator. It narrows the vision until the predator can't see the trap snapping shut around its ankles. I stepped back into the shadows and walked away, my footsteps silent on the Persian runner. Let her think she was winning. I woke at 4 a.m. to a hollow sensation in the room. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't movement. It was an absence, the way you can feel when something familiar has been removed from a space you know intimately. I lay still for a moment, listening to the house settle around me, the creaks and sighs of old wood adjusting to the temperature. Then I reached for the nightstand, my hands searching for the cool, familiar weight of my vintage engagement ring, the one I took off before bed and placed in the porcelain dish Jim had given me on our 5th anniversary. The dish was empty. I sat up, my heart hammering in my chest with a force that made my ribs ache. I turned on the lamp, the sudden brightness making me squint, and stared at the nightstand. Gone. Not misplaced. Not fallen behind the furniture. Gone. The ring Jim had saved 3 years of a firefighter's salary to buy. The one he'd proposed with on a rainy Tuesday evening in 1985, kneeling on the floor of my tiny apartment because he couldn't wait for the right moment. The room felt violated. The air thin and wrong, as if someone had sucked out the oxygen and replaced it with something toxic. Megan hadn't just taken a piece of jewelry. She had taken a piece of my identity. A piece of Jim. The last physical connection to the moment he'd looked at me and said, "I want to build a life with you." I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated loathing rise in my chest, a black tide that threatened to break my composure, to send me downstairs to her room to tear the place apart until I found it. I forced myself to breathe. 4 seconds in. 4 seconds out. The technique I'd taught myself during budget hearings when the provost tried to cut funding for student mental health services. A dean does not react with emotion. A dean reacts with a countermeasure. At breakfast, Megan didn't offer tea. She offered a manila envelope. I was sitting at the kitchen table, my own kitchen table, the one I'd refinished myself in 2008, when she slid it across the polished wood surface. Elena stood behind her, holding a phone, the red recording light already active. "It's for your own good, Sarah," Megan said, her voice dripping with performative sympathy, her eyes wide and concerned for the benefit of the camera. "We're just trying to make sure you're safe." I looked at the envelope. It was the legal-sized kind, thick and official, the kind that contained documents that changed lives. I opened it. The first page was a petition for emergency guardianship. My name, Sarah Sterling, was listed under incapacitated person. Megan's name was listed under proposed guardian. I read the citations, my eyes scanning the legal language with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent decades reviewing student conduct reports. Erratic behavior including hoarding of imaginary assets. Disorientation regarding personal property and financial accounts. Unable to manage daily activities without supervision. The hearing was scheduled for 72 hours from now. 3 days. They were moving faster than I'd anticipated. This wasn't a slow campaign of psychological erosion. This was a blitz. They weren't just trying to move me out of my house, they were trying to legally erase my agency, to declare me incompetent before a judge and transfer all decision-making power to Megan. I looked up at her. At the false concern etched into her features. At the phone capturing every moment. The clock was now the primary antagonist. The specialist Megan hired arrived at noon. His name was Dr. Eris, and he had the look of a man who'd spent his career skirting the edges of professional ethics. His suit was cheap, the fabric shiny at the elbows, the tie knotted too tight. His eyes had a wandering quality, never quite focusing on me, always darting to Megan for approval. He sat across from me in the parlor, a clipboard balanced on his knee, a pen clicking in his hand. "Can you tell me what year it is, Mrs. Sterling?" I looked at him. At Megan standing behind him, her expression carefully arranged into one of concerned sadness. At Elena looming in the doorway, her arms crossed, her face impassive. 2026, I said. "And who is the President of the United States?" I paused. Just for a moment. Just long enough to let him think I was struggling to remember. "Donald Trump." He made a note. I saw the way his eyes flicked to Megan before he wrote, the way he adjusted his grip on the pen. He wasn't a doctor. He was a paid witness. "Can you tell me where you are right now?" Another pause. I let my gaze drift to the window, as if I were confused, disoriented. "My home. Kentucky." More notes. More glances at Megan. "And can you tell me about your financial accounts, Mrs. Sterling? How much money do you have?" I saw Megan lean forward slightly, her breath catching. There's the pension. And Jim's insurance. And I trailed off, letting my eyes unfocus. "The accounts. Overseas. For the university." I saw the spark of triumph in Eris's eyes. He thought he'd caught me in a delusion, a sign of cognitive decline. I needed them overconfident. "The ledger, Sarah," Megan prompted, her voice gentle, coaxing, as if she were speaking to a child. She leaned in, her perfume overwhelming in the close space of the parlor. "You mentioned some international accounts?" I looked at her, my expression blank, my eyes slightly unfocused. I let my hands tremble in my lap, a small, performative gesture. "The university," I murmured, my voice trailing off, uncertain. "They needed to keep the endowment safe. From the auditors. The government." Her eyes lit up. She was practically vibrating with excitement, though she tried to hide it behind a mask of concern. "And where are these accounts, Sarah? Can you remember?" "Cayman," I whispered. "And Geneva. And..." I shook my head, as if the memories were slipping away like water through my fingers. Scotland. Royal Bank. Jim. Jim set it up. Before I let my voice break. Let a tear slip down my cheek. Dr. Eris was writing furiously, his pen scratching across the page. Megan exchanged a glance with Elena. I saw the triumph there, the barely concealed glee. She thought I was leaking secrets in my confusion. She believed the fake money was real. And more importantly, she believed I was too far gone to protect it. I was playing the role of the victim so well I could almost feel the phantom weight of the shackles they were preparing. The digital silence was the most jarring. I picked up the kitchen phone the next morning, intending to call my insurance company about a billing question, and heard nothing. Not a dial tone. Not static. Just silence. The line was dead. I tried my laptop, opening it at the desk in the study. The Wi-Fi network prompted for a password I didn't recognize. Sterling_estate_secure had been replaced with new_beginnings_2026. I heard Megan's voice drifting from the porch, bright and cheerful. We're doing a digital detox for the house, guys. It's so important to unplug, to create space for real connection. My mother-in-law has been so dependent on screens, and it's been affecting her cognition. We're going analog for a while. She was cutting my lines of communication. Physically and virtually. Boxing me in, making it impossible to call for help, to check my bank accounts, to reach out to anyone who might intervene. She forgot one thing. I grew up in a world of analog solutions. Before email. Before cell phones. Before the internet turned every human interaction into a transaction mediated by screens. I didn't need Wi-Fi to dismantle a reputation. I just needed patience. I waited until Elena was occupied with a live, cooking segment in the kitchen, some performative nonsense about healing broths for seniors, before slipping into the basement. The stairs creaked under my weight, the sound echoing in the cool, musty darkness. I fumbled for the light switch, the bulb flickering to life and casting harsh shadows across the concrete walls. Behind the furnace, tucked into the gap between the metal casing and the stone foundation, sat Jim's old galvanized emergency kit. I pulled it out, the metal cold and heavy in my hands, and opened the latches. Inside, beneath a tangle of emergency flares and a first aid kit that predated Y2K, sat his high-gain digital recorder. It was rugged, military-grade, designed for fire investigations where conditions were harsh and evidence was critical. Jim had used it to document scene assessments, to record interviews with witnesses, to capture the sounds of structural failures. I turned it over in my hands, checking the battery indicator. Full charge. The device held power for 48 hours of continuous recording. I gripped the cold metal casing, feeling the first spark of genuine hope I'd experienced in days. Megan was so obsessed with the cameras she could see, the black domes mounted in every corner, the phones always recording, that she never considered the microphones she couldn't. The HVAC vents in this house are a masterpiece of mid-century engineering. Jim used to joke that he could hear me on the phone in the study from the bedroom 2 floors up. The ductwork was original, installed in 1947, a labyrinth of connected metal that carried sound from room to room with startling clarity. I stood on a step stool in the service closet off the kitchen, my fingers working the screws of the vent grate with a flathead screwdriver I'd found in Jim's toolbox. The grate came free with a soft metallic groan. I reached into the duct, feeling the cool air from the system, and tucked the recorder deep inside, securing it with a magnetic strip I'd peeled off an old badge holder. It sat directly behind the wall of the parlor. The room where Megan spent her evenings, sprawled on the sofa, phone in hand, plotting her next move. The room where she and Elena whispered about guardianship hearings and transitions, and what to do with the difficult mother-in-law. I replaced the grate, tightening the screws until they were flush, and stepped down from the stool. My heart was hammering a rhythm of tactical anticipation. I wasn't just listening. I was building a cage out of her own words. I found the document by accident. I was in the dining room, dusting the sideboard, an act of defiance, a refusal to let Elena control every aspect of my day, when I noticed a folder tucked beneath Megan's ring light stand. I glanced toward the kitchen. Megan was upstairs, her voice carrying through the ceiling as she filmed another segment. Elena was in the garden. I was alone. I pulled the folder free and opened it. Inside was a draft of a sale agreement for the estate. Legal language, dense and impenetrable, but the key details were clear. Purchase price, $2.1 million. Buyer, a development company I'd never heard of. Closing date, 3 weeks from now. And at the bottom, a signature. David Sterling. The handwriting was shaky, the D trailing off as if his hand had been forced, as if he'd signed while someone stood over him, whispering threats. My breath hitched. She was selling my home out from under me. The house Jim and I had bought in 1992. The house we'd raised David in. The house I'd paid off in 2012 with the last of Jim's life insurance. And she had used David's fear, his terror of prison, of losing everything, to make him the executioner. It wasn't just a house to her. It was a payout. A way to clear her debts and move on to the next con. The betrayal stung more than the fire, more than the stolen ring, more than the cameras. Because David had signed it. I retreated to my bedroom as the sun set, the house falling into that particular kind of silence that comes just before full dark. The red, recording lights of the cameras blinked like predatory eyes, watching me from the corners of the ceiling. I sat on the edge of my bed, my hands folded in my lap, and listened. Through the HVAC vent, I could hear Megan's voice, clear and sharp, carrying up from the parlor below. Once the gala is over and the papers are filed, we move her to the Oaks. She was talking to someone, Elena, probably, or maybe just rehearsing her next live stream. It's a closed ward. No phones, no visitors without approval. The reviews are terrible, but that's the point. She won't last 6 months in there. A pause. Then, quieter, David will do what he's told, or he goes down for the foundation's accounting errors. I made sure his signature is on every shell company document. He's in too deep to back out now. I sat in the dark, the weight of her words settling over me like a shroud. The Oaks. A closed ward. No phones. No visitors. I was 72 hours away from being buried alive in a luxury warehouse for the elderly, a place where women like me went to disappear, to fade into medicated oblivion while their families liquidated their estates. This was the low point. The nadir. The moment when the protagonist realizes that all her planning, all her careful audits and tactical observations, might not be enough. I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, and felt the full weight of my 60 years pressing down on me. But I didn't cry. I had work to do. The morning mist clung to the Kentucky bluegrass like a damp shroud, turning the familiar landscape of my yard into something foreign and ghostly. I stood at the kitchen counter, my hand wrapped around a cup of chamomile tea I had no intention of drinking, and watched Elena through my peripheral vision. She was in the parlor, her back to me, arranging fresh lilies in a vase with the methodical precision of someone who enjoyed watching things wilt. I had approximately 4 minutes. I didn't use the front door. The camera there was Megan's favorite toy. She'd positioned it to capture the charming colonial entrance, for her followers, the white pillars and hanging ferns framing her like a set piece. Instead, I moved through the pantry, past the shelves of organic herbal teas Elena had stocked to replace my Earl Grey, toward the narrow door at the back. The old service entrance. Jim used to come through this door when he arrived home late from the station, his uniform smelling of smoke and courage, not wanting to wake me by using the front. The hinges groaned as I pushed it open, a high, metallic protest that made my heart stutter. I grabbed a silk scarf from the coat hook, a Hermès I'd bought in Paris in 1998, and wrapped it around the hinge mechanism, muffling the sound as I slipped through. The gray light of pre-dawn hit me like cold water. My sensible flats sank into the mud, the damp grass soaking through the canvas immediately. I felt the chill creep up my ankles, my legs, settling in my bones. I felt like a fugitive on my own land. But for the first time in weeks, the unblinking red eyes of the security domes weren't watching me. I was off the grid. The diner was a relic of another era, all formica and grease and the particular smell of coffee that had been sitting on a burner for hours. It sat on the edge of the county line, miles from the manicured lawns and curated aesthetics of Megan's world. The kind of place where truckers stopped for breakfast at 5 a.m. and nobody asked questions about why a 60-year-old woman in a blazer was meeting a man in a suit before sunrise. Marcus Thorne sat in the far booth, his back to the wall, his eyes on the door. He'd always been like that, even as a student. Observant. Strategic. The kind of young man who showed up to my office hours with questions that weren't really questions but tests to see if I was paying attention. I'd liked him immediately. He stood when I approached, his suit too sharp for the setting, the kind of tailored perfection that came from a government salary that finally matched his intellect. "You look tired, Dean," he said, gesturing to the seat across from him. A thick manila folder sat on the table between us, next to a mug of coffee so black it looked like oil. I didn't touch the coffee the waitress had poured for me. I didn't make small talk. I reached for the folder with the steady hand of an administrator preparing for a disciplinary hearing. "I am not tired, Marcus," I said, meeting his gaze. "I am focused." His mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. Marcus tapped the top sheet with one finger, the sound sharp against the formica. "It's a house of cards, Sarah. Her Bloom Foundation is a textbook Ponzi structure." I opened the folder and found myself looking at spreadsheets. Columns of numbers, highlighted discrepancies, transaction logs that told a story of systematic fraud. "She's using charity donations to pay off her personal American Express balances," Marcus continued, his voice low and clinical, "and then soliciting new donors through her live streams to cover the shortfall. The foundation has never actually funded a single project. It's all vapor." My eyes danced over the data, my brain automatically calculating the patterns, the flow of money. In and out. New donors covering old debts. A perpetual motion machine powered by nothing but lies and the gullibility of strangers on the internet. It was sloppy. The work of someone who thought influence was a substitute for actual accounting. Someone who believed that a ring light and a sympathetic smile could paper over the mathematical reality of theft. She wasn't just a mean girl playing at elder abuse. She was a white-collar criminal. The Dean in me, the part that had spent decades evaluating misconduct and determining consequences, felt a clinical satisfaction at the clarity of the rot. This wasn't ambiguous. This wasn't a matter of interpretation or competing narratives. This was evidence. "There's a catch." Marcus's voice dropped an octave, the way it used to when he was about to tell me something he knew I wouldn't want to hear. He flipped to the final page of the folder. Shell company registrations. Articles of incorporation. Operating agreements for LLCs with names like Bloom Ventures and Legacy Holdings and Sterling Properties Group. I felt the air leave my lungs. David's signature was everywhere. Not just as a witness. Not just as a spouse providing consent. As a primary officer. As a registered agent. As the legal architect of the entire structure. "If I hand this to the feds, Sarah," Marcus said quietly, his eyes never leaving my face, "they don't just take her. David is legally the architect of this fraud. The paperwork doesn't distinguish between who signed willingly and who signed under duress. He goes to federal prison for 10 to 15 years. Minimum." The folder suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. My weapon, the evidence I'd been so desperate to find, was a double-edged sword. And its second edge was resting against my son's throat. I sat in that vinyl booth, the smell of burnt coffee and diesel exhaust suddenly suffocating. This was it. The false peak. The moment I thought I'd reached the summit, thought I'd found the solution, only to realize that a chasm lay between me and the actual goal. To save the house, to save myself from being erased and locked away in a closed ward at the Oaks, I would have to sacrifice David. To save David, I would have to let Megan erase me. The math was brutal. Binary. Unforgiving. I looked at Marcus. He was watching me with the same steady, analytical gaze he'd used in my office when he was 19 years old, trying to decide whether to pursue accounting or law. He saw the calculation in my eyes. The way I was running scenarios, weighing costs, evaluating outcomes. Is there a third option? I asked, my voice steady despite the hurricane screaming in my chest. He shook his head slowly. The law is binary, Dean. Someone has to be the principal. Someone has to take the fall. Either she does and David goes with her, or... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. I slipped back through the service door at 7:30 a.m., my heart hammering against my ribs with a force that made me dizzy. The house was already awake. I could hear the hiss of the espresso machine in the kitchen, Megan's pretentious Italian import that cost more than my monthly grocery bill, and the heavy footsteps of Elena moving through the first floor like a warden making rounds. Sarah? Time for your wellness check. I barely had time to kick off my muddy flats and slide my feet into the fleece-lined slippers Elena had bought to replace my dangerous leather ones before she rounded the corner into the pantry. I stood by the kettle, my hand resting on the counter, my expression arranged into the mask of social dean pleasantry I'd perfected over 3 decades of faculty meetings. I was just looking for the Earl Grey, Elena, I said, letting my voice waver slightly, as if I were genuinely confused. I seem to have forgotten where you put it. She smirked, the expression twisting her face into something ugly and satisfied. We talked about this yesterday, Sarah. You're on herbal now. For your blood pressure. She moved past me, close enough that I could smell the menthol on her breath, and pulled down the box of chamomile from the shelf. Let's get you settled in the parlor. Big day today. The gala is tonight. She thought I was disoriented. Lost. A confused old woman who couldn't even remember where her tea was kept. The fox was back in the coop. And the hens had no idea she'd sharpened her teeth. The house was invaded by strangers. Men in black t-shirts and distressed jeans moved through the ballroom, stringing fairy lights across the crown molding and positioning clusters of votives on every available surface. Florists arrived with armloads of lilies, cloying, funeral home lilies that made my sinuses ache and my stomach turn. Megan was in the center of it all, a conductor directing her orchestra of hired help. The Legacy Gala is about transition, guys. Her voice was pitched high, artificially bright, performative joy radiating from her like heat from a flame. She was filming, of course, her phone mounted on a gimbal, capturing every angle. We're honoring the past while embracing the new. It's about gratitude and growth and creating space for what's next. She was turning my home into a stage for her final act. My ballroom, the one where Jim and I had hosted fundraisers for the fire department, where David had danced at his 8th birthday party, where we'd celebrated 30 years of marriage, was being transformed into a backdrop for her digital mythology. I watched from the balcony, a silent ghost in a pressed blazer and pleated skirt, my hands gripping the mahogany railing. I counted every person she was about to lie to. 73 confirmed guests, according to the printout I'd glimpsed on the dining room table. Donors. Influencers. Local politicians. The mayor. 2 state senators. An audience. The movers come Monday, Sarah. Megan cornered me near the grandfather clock, the one Jim had inherited from his father, the one that had kept time in this house since 1952. She reached out and patted my cheek, her touch oily and condescending, the way you'd touch a child or a confused pet. David already signed the sale agreement. Everything is handled. You don't have to worry about a thing. Her smile was wide, her teeth too white, her eyes empty of anything resembling warmth. Don't make a scene at the party tonight, she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper even though there was no one else in the hallway. It would be so undignified. Just sit in the corner, look sweet, and try not to forget where you are. Can you do that for me? I looked at her. Really looked at her. Noted the slight tremor in her hand as she checked her phone notifications. The way her eyes darted to the screen every few seconds, hungry for validation, for proof that her followers still cared. She was broke. Marcus's folder had made that clear. Her creditors were circling. The minimum payments were catching up to her. She was betting everything on this one night. On the gala. On the house sale. On the narrative that she was the hero and I was the confused, tragic burden. Of course, Megan, I said softly. I wouldn't dream of making a scene. I found David in Jim's study just before sunset. The room was dark, the heavy curtains drawn, the only light coming from the hallway where I stood in the doorway. He was sitting in Jim's leather chair, the one that still smelled faintly of pipe tobacco even though Jim had quit smoking 20 years before he died, with a glass of amber liquid in his hand. Whiskey. The expensive kind Jim used to save for special occasions. David, I said softly. He didn't look up. She said if I didn't sign the house over, she'd release the audits. His voice was thin, brittle, the sound of something breaking under pressure it was never designed to withstand. I'm a city councilman, Mom. If that gets out, if people think I was part of a fraud scheme, I'd lose everything. My seat. My reputation. My career. I walked across the Persian rug, my footsteps silent, and stood beside the chair. You've already lost everything if you've lost your soul to a woman who views you as a liability. I took the glass from his hand. Set it on the desk. He looked up at me then, and I saw the boy he used to be. 10 years old and terrified after his first Little League strikeout. 16 and devastated after his first breakup. 25 and grieving at his father's funeral. He sobbed. A sound of pure, helpless terror that broke something in my chest I didn't know could still break. I put my hand on his shoulder and squeezed. I'm going to fix this, I said. I waited until the house was vibrating with the bass of the gala's soundcheck. The DJ Megan had hired was testing the system in the ballroom, the speakers thumping with a rhythm that made the chandelier crystals chime. People were everywhere, caterers, photographers, influencers doing pre-event content in the garden. No one was watching the service closet. I slipped inside, my fingers trembling slightly as I unscrewed the HVAC grate with the flathead screwdriver I'd hidden in my blazer pocket. The metal was cold against my palm. My hand found the rugged casing of the recorder, and I pulled it out, praying the battery had held. 48 hours of recording time. I'd planted it 3 days ago. If there was no miracle on this tape, I was out of moves. I retreated to the laundry room, the only space in the house without a camera, a blind spot Megan had overlooked because it wasn't aesthetic enough for content, and plugged in the headphones Jim used to use when he listened to audiobooks. The tape hissed. Then Megan's voice filled my ears. Of course he didn't sign the second set, Elena. I did. I froze, my hand gripping the edge of the washing machine so hard my knuckles went white. Megan's voice was clear, undistorted, as crisp as if she were standing beside me. I'd been practicing his scrawl for months. You should see the signature cards I made, they're perfect. David's too weak to even notice he's being framed. Her laughter came through the headphones, sharp and crystalline and utterly damning. Elena's voice, lower, rougher, what if he figures it out? He won't. And even if he does, what's he going to do? Go to the police and admit he's married to a con artist? He's in too deep. He'll take the fall with me before he risks his precious reputation. I felt a surge of adrenaline that made my vision blur, my hands shake. She had admitted to forgery. She had admitted to coercion. She had admitted that David's liability was a fiction, a construction designed to control him. The law is a game of intent. And I had just captured hers. By proving she forged his secondary signatures, the ones on the shell company registrations Marcus had shown me, I could legally sever David's liability. I had my third option. I stood in the laundry room, the white noise of the dryer humming in the background, the recorder still warm in my hands. I could take this to the police now. Walk out the front door, drive to the station, hand over the evidence. They'd arrest her before the gala even started. But Megan would spin it. She'd cry on camera. She'd claim I'd manipulated the recording, that I was a confused old woman with a vendetta. She'd delay, obfuscate, deploy her army of followers to create reasonable doubt. And the house would still be sold. The sale agreement David signed, the primary one, the one he actually signed, would still be valid. No. A dean doesn't just resolve a conflict. A dean sets a precedent. I would let her have her gala. I would let her invite her 73 guests and her cameras and her live stream audience. I would let her reach the very height of her curated power, the moment where she stood at the podium in my ballroom and announced her triumph. And then, in front of everyone, would conduct a public audit that would leave her with nowhere to hide. I tucked the recorder into my blazer pocket and walked toward the door. It was time to get ready for a party. I stood before the mahogany mirror in my bedroom, the one Jim had hung for me in 1993 because he said a woman should be able to see herself properly when she dressed for important occasions. This was an important occasion. My hands were steady as I buttoned my midnight blue silk blouse, the fabric cool and precise against my skin. I reached for the tailored charcoal blazer hanging on the back of the door, my hearing armor, the one I used to wear when I had to deliver bad news to a student's parents or testify before the board of trustees. The fit was perfect. Sharp shoulders. Clean lines. The kind of tailoring that communicated authority without saying a word. I didn't look like a confused senior. I looked like a woman who could rescind a tenure track with a single pen stroke. I pinned Jim's fire chief's signet ring to a thin gold chain and fastened it around my neck, tucking it beneath my collar where it rested against my collarbone. The weight was grounding, a small piece of metal carrying the authority of 30 years of public service. I applied lipstick. Not the soft, age-appropriate pink Elena had suggested during one of her wellness consultations. A sharp, clinical red. The kind I used to wear to disciplinary hearings when I needed the student to understand that I was not their friend. I looked at myself in the mirror. The dean was no longer in retirement. I was back on campus, and the first item on the agenda was an expulsion. The ballroom was a fever dream of silk, champagne, and the blinding white glare of ring lights. 73 guests in cocktail attire milled through the space that had once been reserved for fire department fundraisers and anniversary celebrations. The fairy lights Megan's crew had strung across the crown molding cast everything in a soft, flattering glow. The lilies, God, those oppressive lilies, filled every corner with their cloying, funeral home scent. A photographer circled the room, capturing candid moments for Megan's social media. A videographer stood by the podium, his camera trained on the space where Megan would soon deliver her triumph. I descended the staircase, my hand light on the banister, my steps measured and deliberate. Elena moved to intercept me at the bottom, her hand reaching for my elbow to guide me toward the assisted seating she'd arranged in the corner, a wingback chair positioned away from the main action, a place where the confused mother-in-law could sit quietly and not embarrass herself. I didn't flinch. I simply turned my head and gave her the look. The one that had silenced 1,000 rowdy lecture halls. The one that made freshmen sit up straight and graduate students reconsider their life choices. "Remove your hand, Elena," I said, my voice low and level, "or I will discuss the missing silver and your lack of a nursing license with the sheriff standing by the buffet." I saw him there, Sheriff Tom Brennan, a man whose daughter I'd personally mentored through a crisis during her sophomore year. He was helping himself to a canopy, oblivious to the drama about to unfold. Elena froze. Her smirk dissolved into a mask of uncertainty, her hand dropping from my elbow as if I'd burned her. I marched past her, my spine a steel rod, and walked directly into the center of the ballroom. Megan stood at the podium, resplendent in her ivory dress. It was designer, of course. Probably borrowed or purchased on one of the credit cards Marcus had documented in his folder. The fabric shimmered under the chandelier light, catching every flash from the photographer's camera. She held her phone aloft, the screen tilted to capture her face and the crowd behind her. "And so," she chirped, her voice amplified by the professional sound system she'd rented, "as we move forward with the Bloom Foundation's new headquarters here at the Sterling Estate, we honor the legacy by letting go of the past." She paused for effect, her smile wide and practiced. "We're creating space for new beginnings, for growth, for a future that honors tradition while embracing change. I'm so grateful to all of you for being part of this journey." She signaled to her followers watching the live stream, encouraging them to heart the stream, to flood the comments with support. The audience applauded politely. Some of them looked genuinely moved. Others, the ones who'd known Jim, who'd attended his funeral, who remembered what this house had meant to our family, looked uncomfortable, their applause half-hearted. Megan was at the summit of her arrogance. She held the narrative like a trophy, the deed to my house tucked in a decorative folder on the podium beside her. She thought the gavel had already fallen. She thought she'd won. "A wonderful speech, Megan." My voice cut through the applause like a scalpel through skin. I didn't shout. I didn't raise my voice. I used the dean's projection, the tone I'd developed over decades of addressing auditoriums and stadium graduations, a voice designed to carry to the back of a room and command immediate attention. The applause died. Every head in the room turned toward me. I walked toward the podium, the crowd parting like the Red Sea, guests stepping aside to let me pass. Megan's smile faltered. Just for a second. A flicker of panic crossed her heart-shaped face before she smoothed it back into performative warmth. "But you forgot to introduce our guest of honor," I continued, my eyes locked on hers. I reached the podium. Didn't wait for her permission. Didn't ask if I could speak. I placed my hand on the microphone stand, my fingers closing around the cool metal, and for a second we were two predators over a single kill. Her eyes darted to Elena. To the photographer. To the exits. She was calculating. Trying to decide if she should embrace this moment as part of the heartwarming family reconciliation narrative or if she should shut me down. She chose wrong. "Oh, Sarah," she said, her voice dripping with condescension for the benefit of the cameras, "you're so confused. This isn't the time for a toast." She reached for my arm. I leaned into the microphone. "This isn't a toast, Megan," I said. "This is a deposition." I looked into the crowd and found Marcus. He stood near the back, partially hidden behind a cluster of influencers checking their phones. His suit was dark, his expression neutral, his posture radiating the quiet authority of someone who held significant institutional power. A thick folder was tucked under his arm. I gave a single, sharp nod. The go signal. The same gesture I used to use during faculty meetings to indicate that it was time to move forward with a vote, time to execute the plan we discussed in private. Marcus began to move forward, his presence a dark, bureaucratic shadow cutting through the glitter and champagne. Megan tried to laugh it off. She turned back to her camera, her phone still recording, her smile strained. "Everyone, this is just a little family confusion. Sarah sometimes gets overwhelmed at events like this." Let's give her some space. She reached for my arm again, trying to physically remove me from the podium. I didn't move. I suggest you let go of me, Megan, I said quietly, and listen very carefully to what happens next. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out the small remote I'd synced to the house's smart speaker system. Jim had installed it years ago so we could play music throughout the house during parties. Megan had co-opted it for her own purposes, using it to create ambience for her live streams. Now it was mine again. I pressed play. The music died. The soft jazz that had been providing background atmosphere cut out abruptly, leaving the room in sudden, jarring silence. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then Megan's voice boomed from every speaker in the ballroom, from the HVAC vents, from the sound system, from the hidden speakers mounted in the crown molding. Of course he didn't sign the second set, Elena. I did. I'd been practicing his scrawl for months. The room went ice cold. I watched Megan's face drain of color, the artificial tan suddenly looking garish and fake against the stark white of her dress. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, no sound emerging. Her own voice continued, crystal clear, utterly damning. You should see the signature cards I made, they're perfect. David's too weak to even notice he's being framed. The laughter that followed, her laughter, sharp and crystalline and cruel, echoed through the ballroom like a death knell. 73 pairs of eyes turned from her to me and back again. Phones that had been recording her triumph were now recording her destruction. Turn it off. Megan's shriek was raw, stripped of all the curated warmth she used for her followers. She lunged for the control panel, her ivory dress tangling around her legs, her designer heels catching on the edge of the podium. It's a deep fake. She's demented. She doesn't know what she's. But Marcus was already there, blocking her path with the weight of the federal government behind him. He was calm. Professional. His hand was steady as he pulled a document from the folder under his arm. A subpoena. He held it up for the cameras to see, the official seal of the Department of Justice clearly visible. Megan Sterling, he said, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom, you are being served in connection with a federal investigation into the Bloom Foundation for embezzlement, wire fraud, coercion, and identity theft. The ring lights, the ones that had been her halo, her tools of empowerment and influence, now felt like searchlights in a prison yard. The audience began to mutter. Whispers rippled through the crowd like a wave. Phones that had been pointed at Megan in adoration were now capturing her collapse in real time, her carefully constructed brand disintegrating before a live audience. I stood at the podium, watching the comments section of her live stream on the monitor the videographer had set up. The hearts that usually flooded her streams were gone. In their place, angry faces. Shocked emojis. Words like scam and fraud and disgusting scrolling past faster than I could read. The law is a game of intent, Megan, I said, my voice echoing the clinical coldness of the recording still playing softly in the background. I let the silence stretch. Let her stand there, frozen, while her world imploded. And you just admitted yours to 300 of our neighbors and 50,000 of your followers. I looked her in the eye, watching the realization hit her in real time. You didn't just forge my son's name. You forged a life that never existed. A brand built on theft and manipulation and the systematic abuse of a woman you thought was too old and too confused to fight back. I paused. You were wrong. Her brand didn't just break. It incinerated. Megan collapsed into a chair, her legs giving out beneath her. Her phone slipped from her fingers and hit the parquet floor with a crack, the screen shattering into a spiderweb of broken glass. The influencer was gone. In her place was a terrified 28-year-old whose credit cards had finally been declined by reality. Elena tried to slip toward the exit, her gray tunic making her nearly invisible against the wall. She was met by two uniformed deputies who'd been enjoying the buffet moments earlier. Sheriff Brennan stepped forward, his face grave. "Elena Martinez? We have some questions about your nursing credentials. Or lack thereof." The Legacy Gala had become a crime scene. I watched as the socialites, the same ones who had whispered about my decline in the grocery store, who had avoided my calls, who had believed Megan's narrative without question, suddenly looked away in shame. Some of them left quietly, slipping out the side doors. Others stood frozen, their phones still recording, not wanting to miss the conclusion of the drama. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel vindication. I felt the satisfaction of a corrected ledger. Of a system restored to balance. Of a precedent set that would echo through this community for years. The afterglow was swift and professional. 2 officers led Megan out the front door, her hands cuffed behind her back, the ivory dress now rumpled and stained with champagne someone had spilled in the chaos. She didn't look at the cameras this time. She looked at her feet, at the mud on her ivory shoes, at the gravel of the driveway she'd never own. Elena followed, silent and surly, her smirk finally gone. The live stream was still running. Megan's phone lay on the floor where it had fallen, the cracked screen still broadcasting to her 50,000 followers. The camera angle was wrong, capturing only the feet of departing guests and the flashing blue lights of the police cruisers reflected in the white colonial pillars. I walked over, picked up the phone, and looked into the lens. 52,000 viewers now. The numbers were climbing as word spread. I tapped end stream. The red recording light went dark. The performance was over. The house was quiet again. The caterers had packed up their equipment and left without being asked. The photographer had deleted his photos at my request, or rather, at Sheriff Brennan's strongly worded suggestion. The socialites had scattered like roaches when the lights came on. The smell of cloying lilies was fading, replaced by the scent of evening dew on the bluegrass drifting through the open French doors. David stood on the porch, his face pale but clear. The haunted look, the one he'd carried for weeks, the weight of fear and shame and compromised integrity, was gone. In its place was exhaustion and something deeper. Relief. And shame. He looked at me, and I saw both emotions warring in his eyes. He knew he'd been saved. He knew that Marcus's evidence and my recording had legally severed his liability, that he wouldn't be charged alongside Megan. But he also knew the price. He would have to spend the rest of his life earning back the sterling name. Proving that his father's legacy of service and honor wasn't just empty words. Demonstrating that a moment of weakness under duress didn't define him. I didn't hug him. I walked to the garden shed, pulled out a trowel, and handed it to him. "The garden needs work, David," I said. "Start with the roses." He took the tool, his hands closing around the wooden handle. And he nodded. I returned to Jim's study. I closed the heavy mahogany door, shutting out the world, the lingering guests, the cleanup, the aftermath. The room was exactly as I'd left it before the gala. The desk. The leather chair. The smell of old books and cedarwood. I sat down and opened my planner. The leather was warm, familiar, grounding. I found the entry labeled Crisis Management and drew a single, thick line through it with my fountain pen. A decisive mark. Completed. Resolved. Every book was back in its place on the shelves. The fire chief's uniform was being professionally cleaned and would be returned to its archival box tomorrow. The journals Megan had burned, those were gone forever, but I'd filed a police report documenting their destruction. Evidence. Always evidence. I adjusted my glasses and pulled a fresh ledger toward me. Tomorrow, I would begin documenting the estate restoration. The repairs. The restoration of order. The hierarchy was restored. I looked out the window at my estate. The white pillars stood guard under the Kentucky moon. The bluegrass stretched out like a sea of shadows. David was in the garden, on his knees, working the soil the way his father used to. In this house, there is only one Dean. The lesson is simple: never mistake silence for weakness. If you made it to this moment, thank you for listening all the way through. Most people bail before the bill comes due. But here, the bill always comes due. What started as humiliation and disrespect ended with receipts, truth, and a payoff they never saw coming. If you want more stories where karma shows up without mercy, hit subscribe and come back for the next one. Now tell me in the comments, what was the most disgusting thing they did? What crossed the line for you?